Hi everyone and welcome to this week's Wallsend history story. This week is video number 2 in the series about Wallsend public houses. I hope you will enjoy it. As said previously, this isn't a full history of each pub. It's a basic history with a few little news articles about things that happened there in the past or things connected to them. There will be more details about some pubs than others, as some just don't seem to have much information available. The first pub I am going to talk about is the Anchor Hotel. There was a pub in this location from at least 1850, but it went by the name of the Horse and Hounds. I did do a little archive search online, but I wasn't really able to find any details about it. Later, in around 1862, it was known as the Hare and Hounds. I was a little luckier in searching this and did manage to find an advert for a quoits match there in February of 1862. At this point in time, the pub would appear to be in the ownership of a Mr. Robert Arthur, and there was another quoits match there in June of 1864. And in 1867 I found details of an auction which was taking place there, and the advert said that it was to be held in Mr. Newton's Hare and Hounds Inn at Wallsend. The majority of information I found was pretty much the same as what I've already mentioned, mostly quoits matches and using the pub to hold auctions for other buildings in the area. I do have to admit to thinking of pubs with the name Horse and Hounds or Hare and Hounds as being country pubs, but back when this pub was first built, Wallsend would have been a lot more like a country area than it is today, as it was a lot less built up, and as I have said before, it was mostly fields and farms. By around 1867, the pub was known by the name of the Anchor Hotel. But this would have been probably late 1867, because earlier in 1867 it was still the Hare and Hounds. I don't know who decided on the name change, but I do know that by 1871 the innkeeper and owner was a Mr. George Fogg, and he was living there with his wife Jane and their 2 daughters, and he remained in the Anchor until at least 1881, but by the 1890s he had moved to another area. George died in around 1922, I believe he was around about 82 years old, and he is buried in Churchbank Cemetery. The next owner after George was a W.J. Sanderson in 1894, and William Cawthorne was the innkeeper in 1890. The front of the Anchor originally looked very much like that of the Queen's Head, and I do remember once looking at an old photo and getting the Anchor mixed up with the Queen's. Sometime later, the front of the pub was changed to look how it does today. Unfortunately, I was unable to find the date of the alterations, so if anyone knows, do please let me know. It is quite a large pub, as the rear stretches down into Portugal Place. The Anchor has been known by several different names over the years, such as Jimmy's, Chadwick's, often called Chadwick's 2, and the new Anchor in 1990. In more recent years it had been known as Last Orders, until another change of name in around 2016, when it reverted back to being called the Anchor. The Anchor was another pub that I didn't really go into that often. I did go there in recent years when it was under the Last Orders name, but I am sure that many Wallsenders, as I often say, will remember going here and having a few good nights out. The next pub I am talking about is the Duke of York. The pub that we see on the High Street today is not the original pub or even in the original location. The original pub was a little further along the High Street, heading in the direction of Walker. It was built in around 1850, and by the early 1900s it was clearly not in a very good condition. In 1903 the licence was objected to because of the dilapidated and insanitary condition of the building. However, it was eventually granted, as there had been no objection from the police. But by 1904 the same objections arose, but this time the police also objected. It was said at the time that the old pub was being demolished and plans were in hand to build a new pub. So for the time being, the police withdrew their objection and the licence was again granted. Although I haven't been completely able to narrow down the date that the current pub was built, some articles I read had said that it was as late as 1928. However, it was certainly there by the time the 1913 map of the area was published, and I would take a guess that it had been there since around 1905 to 1906, purely based on the fact that in 1904 they were planning to build the new pub, and it seems unlikely that they would have been granted another licence on the old one. And also the pub was sold for a fair amount in 1920, and I don't think anyone would have bought a run-down building in those days. Just talking a little more about the original Duke of York, one of the early licensees was John Morris. And John was the licensee from around 1877. In 1888, he was running rabbit coursing competitions in the field next to the pub, and also sometimes at Biggs's Main. I have to say that I was quite amazed to find that one of the dogs used in 1888 was actually named Jack the Ripper. Now, 1888 was of course at the beginning of the Whitechapel murders in London and the start of the Jack the Ripper cases, but it still seems like an odd name to give to your dog. The rabbit coursing seems to have been very popular, but a little too much of a gruesome sport for my liking. In 1890, John was taken to court for opening the pub during prohibited hours on Christmas Day, and for this he was fined 5 shillings and costs. And it would seem that in 1880 John had had a compensation claim in with the North Eastern Railway for an accident he had been in which had left him unable to manage the pub for quite some time. He was granted the sum of £175, which today would be around £26,000, so it was quite a lot of money and probably a lot more than he would have been making running the pub. John was also the man who had had the Carville Hotel built in 1893, with the intention of his son running that while he continued with the Duke of York. However, this was not allowed by the licensing board, and it would not be until 1895 that the licence was granted and his son Thomas finally took on the Carville Hotel. Moving on now to the Duke of York building that we know today. There wasn't a lot of information about the later pub, but in 1916 a little article I found said that the then manager, William Lawson, was fined 15 shillings for allowing light to be seen from his premises in June of the same year. This was of course during World War I, when blackout rules were very strict. In February of 1920, a man by the name of George Duncan bought the Duke of York for £22,500. It seems that he was a man who was buying a lot of public houses, some to rent out to others and some that he planned to manage himself. However, a little later in 1920, the Duke of York was back up for sale, but it did not reach the asking price and was withdrawn from sale when it failed to pass £16,000. George did later manage to sell it for £25,000 in 1925. George unfortunately found himself in the bankruptcy courts a few years later, having spent around £53,000 on pubs and cinemas, some of which at the time of his bankruptcy hearing were thousands of pounds in debt. The Duke of York is classed as the last pub on the High Street, and I believe that this is another pub that has always been known by its original name. It was not one that I went in very often, and I think the last time I was in there would have been way back in 2015. I am sure many of you listening can remember good nights out in the Duke of York. The Duke of York is still open today and still trading as a pub, but I believe the opening hours are slightly different to the other pubs on the High Street, with it only being open nightly and only around 4 nights a week. The last pub that I am covering in this video is the Jolly Sailors Inn. This is one pub with very little available history, but as the building is still standing, I really didn't want to miss it out. Probably built prior to 1822, but no exact date is actually known. One of the first known licensees of the Jolly Sailors is Alexander Pauling in 1872, and the owner at that time was a James Aitchison of Willington Quay. A lot of the stories that I was able to find about the pub were cases of drunk and disorderly in the 1800s, such as an incident with Charles Cairns, the son of the then innkeeper Robert Cairns, who had been struck on the head with a glass in 1889. The man who did it said that he might have done it, but he couldn't remember naught about it. And in 1885, Thomas Rennick was fined 2 shillings and 6pence for being drunk and apparently riotous in the Jolly Sailors in January of that year. And in 1886, another man by the name of Stewart had been arguing in the pub and had been evicted by the police, and he found himself with a 5 shillings fine. One thing I did find was an article from 1898, and this described the pub as being called the 3 Jolly Sailors, not the Jolly Sailors Inn, and the owner at that time was a Mr. Robert Emerson, and he wanted to make some substantial alterations to the pub. To me, this sounds like it was, like many of the other high street pubs, much smaller than the building we see today. His plan was to pull down the adjoining shop and rebuild or extend the pub on the site of the shop, and the plans were actually approved. The architect at the time was a Mr. Simpson of Newcastle, so I think that we can thank him for the building that we see today. Sadly, I have not been able to find any details of the name change from the 3 Jolly Sailors to the Jolly Sailors Inn, or vice versa. The pub was still open in 1961, as the licensee at the time was a Mr. Oliver, but it seems there are no known details of when it closed for good, though I do think that it was open for quite some time after 1961. So if anyone listening thinks they know when it closed, do please let me know. This is one pub where I definitely never went in, as it was no doubt closed long before I was legally old enough to drink on the high street. But can anyone listening to this video remember going to the Jolly Sailors Inn? In later years, the lower ground floor level of the pub has had many uses, as shops and cafes among other things. And although it is no longer a public house, it's nice to know that the building is still there and still in use to some extent. I hope you have enjoyed this little video and found some of the stories interesting. Thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.